Our first award this evening goes to a man who has spent more than 40 years in broadcasting and journalism. It all started when he was drafted into the Army in 1965 and became the editor of the Post newspaper at Fort Sheridan in Illinois. He was then sent to Vietnam, where he served with the 15th Public Information Detachment as a combat correspondent with the 25th Infantry Division in Cu Chi in 1966. Primary covering operations of the 1st of the 27th and the 2nd of the 27th Wolfhounds, and editing and writing features for this division's monthly magazine, Ambush.
After Vietnam, he immediately began a long and distinguished career. Among many highlights, he has written, produced, or directed many documentaries and specials for PBS, CBS, and ABC. That includes PBS's A Program for Vietnam Veterans and Everyone Else Who Should Care, which has been used by vet centers across the nation, and producing and writing the 1987 HBO special, Welcome Home Vietnam Vets. He also has written 5 books, including None Braver, U.S. Air Force Pararescue, Men in the War on Terrorism, and his latest book, The Liberators, America's Witness to the Holocaust.
Along the way, he has many awards, including the Peabody Award, the DuPont Columbia Citation, a Writers Guild Award, several Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and PBS Awards, and 8 Emmy Awards. We are adding to that impressive list tonight as we present the VVA Excellent in the Arts Award for a VVA Life member, Michael Hirsh.
Congratulations. Thank you. Said, we're always very proud of the Vietnam veterans that we had come up and that we've had shown how we're not just some of the Hollywood stereotypes, that many of us have gone on to very wonderful things, and Michael's a classic example of that. Please.
Thank you very much. This is really an honor. When Mark Leibson first told me about this, he said I'd have an opportunity to speak, and I asked for how long. And he said, well, Lincoln said everything he had to say in the Gettysburg Address, and he wrote it on the back of an envelope. And I figured, hey, I can make that work. Just a second. I was a journalist before the war and an Army combat correspondent in Vietnam. As you just heard, I went there with the 15th Public Information Detachment, which was the first such unit to go into combat since World War II. We were sent to Cu Chi in early 1966, where the 2nd Brigade of the 25th Division was turning a peanut field into a base camp. Initially, I covered combat operations of the Wolfhounds, the 1st and 2nd 27th. And after 6 months, I was assigned to edit the division's monthly magazine. And since I was my own boss, I could decide what stories I wanted to write. I did some really stupid things. I flew with the forward air controllers and the O-1E bird dogs about half a dozen times. That's where you just fly around and wait for somebody to shoot at you. I did a bombing and strafing mission in the back seat of an F-100. I did combat assaults because, frankly, I'd begun to feel that if I didn't get hit, I wasn't really doing the best job I could do, and that would disappoint my father. When I returned home to finish college at the University of Illinois in Chicago, I felt like an alien from another planet. I was the oldest 23-year-old on that campus. I only weighed 145 pounds, the results of what I like to say was 6 weeks running. And I had a great tan, which really made me an oddball in that terrible winter of Chicago. But no one asked about the war. No one cared. That pisses me off now more than it did then, especially when I get those letters from the Alumni Association asking for money. I did make several anti-war speeches off campus, where I correctly predicted the results of the war and said we should end it quickly and bring the troops home. But I also went after the anti-war crowd, who at the time were picketing Dow Chemical for making napalm. What I said is, if you want the troops to come home now, that's great. But while they're over there, they have to be given every possible means, every tool to help them survive. And that includes napalm. Dead is dead. It doesn't matter what we use on the enemy if it keeps us alive. I went into broadcasting, and when colleagues learned that I was a Vietnam vet, they often suggested that I write a book about it, and I probably had the material in my head. But I also felt that I didn't have the right to author a book about the war. The only guys who should do that, I felt, were the guys who were in combat full-time. I was lucky. I didn't have to spend weeks in the bush. I could hop on a resupply ship and go back to base camp and write my stories and get my film developed whenever I wanted to. And there were times, actually, when the guys I was covering would practically force me to leave. They told me to get the hell out of there if I didn't have to be there. For about 35 years now, I've been trying to find Jerry Snyder, who was a medic with the 2nd 27, who kept me out of trouble in the field. I still feel an obligation to say thank you. I was relieved when Philip Caputo wrote the book A Rumor of War, and when it was published. That's the book I knew that had to be written about the Vietnam War, and Caputo, who is a previous recipient of this honor, was the perfect guy to write it. He took the Vietnam book monkey off my back. But I guess some sort of monkey was still there, and that's what led in 1984 to my producing the PBS special, a program for Vietnam veterans and everyone else who should care. There's not much of a chip on my shoulder with that title. The purpose was to show vets that it was now safe for them to talk about the war, that Americans were finally ready to listen. We taped it at the University of Wisconsin in front of 2,000 students. It was the first time that I dealt professionally as a journalist with PTSD. And it was also the first time that as a television producer, I cried my way through a 4-hour taping, just listening to those 18 men and women talk about what life was like for them back in the world, bearing the burden of a war that wouldn't go away, and getting help to cope. A few years later, Senator Bob Dole began talking about having a little 3-day war in Nicaragua, and it seemed as though President Reagan was paying attention to him. Our son was about to turn 18. I went nuts. Didn't we learn anything from Vietnam? Along with about 40 other Vietnam vets, I marched up the hill to Reagan's Santa Barbara Ranch. The sign I carried said, "Not with my son, you don't." And I began talking to high school classes about my war experience. My message was simple. It went like this. You and your folks need to understand that if they send you to war, they have no right to expect you to come back. And if they're lucky enough to get you back, they have to realize that the person who comes home is much different than the person they sent over there. Now let's fast forward to the present, where once again I found myself dealing professionally with PTSD. For the past 2 years, I was working on a book. I tracked down and interviewed U.S. Army veterans of World War II who liberated the Nazi concentration and death camps. Those 160 interviews are the heart and soul of the book, The Liberators, America's Witnesses to the Holocaust. And those men and women that I talked to told me a lot of horrible things, but the most surprising was that they were still dealing with that dreadful experience. Can you imagine how I felt hearing a 90-year-old man tell me that he still has flashbacks, that he still has night sweats, that his wife wakes him up because he's been thrashing in bed, punching and kicking and screaming? Harry Feinberg told me that only a few nights before I interviewed him in his New Jersey home, his wife had to wake him up from a flashback. He said, I asked her, was it the war, Edie? Yes, Harry, it was the war. Harry said that a few years ago he saw a VA psychiatrist and asked him for pills to make it stop. And the shrink said, Harry, there are no pills. 65 years after the experience, it's still tearing a lot of those guys and their families apart. And most of them never got help, because it wasn't until a decade after our generation came home from our war that the condition was really recognized, and by then a lot of them felt that they were beyond help. When I talk about my book, I tell the audience that there are many lessons they can take from it. It's not just a Holocaust book. It's about war, and what it does to the people who fight. I tell them something all of you know. A war doesn't end just because some diplomat or general signs a piece of paper. And I tell them that at the very least, they have to be vocal, very vocal, about the need to support and care for the men and women we send to war long after they've come home. Throwing them, us, a parade once a year doesn't cut it. And I tell them that sticking a $2 I support the troops ribbon on their car is a smug, empty gesture if that's all they do. Sorry about that, but I'm too short to be subtle. I'm grateful to all of you for this honor. For me, it's the ultimate welcome home.